identity access management, small business owners, what's the one critical thing if our listeners should walk away with understanding the importance? What's one thing they should absolutely take away? And if it's not there in their business today, and it should be, what is that?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about security in general in your small business, man, there's just so many layers where you can get compromised, right? And it's incredibly hard to keep your arms around all of it. This is number one: protecting identity and access. I've seen in a number of places the quote that hackers no longer break in, they log in. And that's the reality. The overwhelming majority of breaches are utilizing legitimate credentials for illegitimate purposes. And so that's why the focus has got to be about protecting the identities. And that involves a marriage between your people, your process, and your technology, right? The users have to be able to understand the processes. And then you have to also have the tools in place to allow them to make that a little bit more convenient, a little bit more accessible for them as end users. The other thing to keep in mind is that identity and access management program, it's more than just usernames and passwords. It's a broader concept than that. But at the end of the day, today in 2023, this is the number one thing you've got to focus on. You've got to make sure that when a system is being accessed, it's being accessed by the person you intended it to, and they only have access to the things you intend them to have access to.
Describe the two, identity and access management. How would you give it in its simplest form? What's the difference between the two?
Well, really at the high level, identity and access management is making sure that the right person has the right access to the right resource. And that's whether you're talking about digital or physical, right? I mean, that's been in its basic form, people have been looking to manage identity and access for as long as people have been thinking of my stuff, right? From a simple business explanation and understanding perspective, right person with the right access to the right resources from the right device.
Okay. And I mean, it sounds super simple, but I have to imagine, in any business, when you hire somebody, you have someone that's fulfilling a certain role. The expectation is that when I sit down at my desk and I open up my computer and you expect me to do my job, I should be able to click a button, open up my email or open up an application, and I shouldn't be met with any error. I should be able to do those things pretty simply because that's the role you put me in. And I guess that's my expectation. What should the expectation be for business users and business owners?
Well, I think consistency is what the expectation should be. Okay. Right. When you as a user are going through from that perspective to access resources, you just need to know what's coming up, right? I might need to be able to provide a password or a token or a PIN or, handle this push notification that's coming across my phone. As long as you're aware of those things and know how to use it, then that should be able to keep you productive and moving while also providing the security you need. Identity and access is always going to come back to this inherent tension that exists between secure and convenient, right? Typically, anything that's more convenient is less secure. Anything that's more secure is less convenient. And it's just kind of how it works. But it's for each business, it's where do you fall on that scale and what's more important or what's more necessary for you within the business, and then trying to map tools, processes, user education to those types of things.
One question I was going to ask you, Mark, I thought about this as we were preparing for this podcast. I've seen this happen different ways, different times. So we talked about this concept of security and convenience, right? So I expect that when I sit down at a PC that all my applications work. So I've seen one end of the spectrum where somebody sits down and they expect something to work and it doesn't, or they don't have access to it, and then it creates a problem for them in the moment that they have to solve. Then again, I've also seen other ends of the spectrum where as people are onboarded or come to an organization, they're asked a series of questions to make sure they have everything that they need before they start work. So my question to you is, as a business owner, what's the best approach you should take to ensure the fine balance between productivity, convenience, and security as you're bringing in people to an organization to make sure that they're not impacted negatively as they go about doing their daily role, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. I think there's probably two components to it. One is the concept of role-based access, right? And then the other part of it is data classification. So if you've got clear roles within your organization about who's doing what, and then on the other side, you've got clear understanding of what's sensitive and who needs access to be able to do their job, right? To be able to deliver value, you can match those two things up to be able to say, okay, this person should have access, this person shouldn't. And it really shouldn't be a surprise, at the time when that person's starting. I think that particularly when we talk about this in the concept of small businesses, the first part of that, the idea of roles is what's, basically overlooked, in the majority of small businesses. I mean, again, you think about somebody who's even, I'd say up to about 20 users in that organization, there's a lot of stuff that's flying at you, and so as a leader or decision maker within a small business, it's a more challenging and more time consuming effort to be able to say, here are all the roles we need within the business, particularly when you know that 5 of those are going to go to one person. So what you start to do is, instead of assigning roles or assigning data access permissions based on roles, you start doing it just on tasks. Hey, I want this person to do that, so they need access to this. Well, they've gotten access to something that is far greater than that one task. But not only are they provisioned for that access in the moment when they need to do the task, rarely is it decommissioned after the fact. And so they just have standing access to more information than they need, which may or may not be a challenge as long as that account is not compromised. But so often what we find is that it's, oh, I didn't have to worry about employee X. I trust them. They're part of the valued member of the team, no problem. But their account got compromised because there weren't enough protections around that account, because we forgot that we had assigned them access for a task instead of a role. And we assigned that to, high level sensitivity information. And now where we discovered that is because somebody took advantage and, got access to something they shouldn't have. And so I think that what the most recent events around passwords and some of identities, it's kind of called out, and we've seen this, even a little bit more up close, is this idea that for many, it's password management is the consideration, but identity and access is much, much broader than just the idea of passwords. When you think about passwords, they serve one function within identity and access management, which is to validate or authenticate whatever credential has been presented to the system. So when you go to log in with your username, that's telling the system who you are. It's asking you to authenticate who you are, which is primarily done by just a password. Unfortunately, well, since the beginning of computers, that's been a problem. It's grown in its scale and complexity in terms of protecting that, because some of the challenge also comes from the idea that people conflate an account or a digital identity with a person. And so when they're making decisions around, I am trusting Mike Almeida, they forget that it's not always Mike Almeida who may be using that identity to log in. And so the point of authentication is to make sure that the credentials are being accessed, or the system's being accessed by Mike Almeida. So that's why you bring in multiple forms of authentication.
Yeah, and I think this concept. It's easier to see in the physical, right? I could tell you a couple of years ago. This is kind of funny. When I went back to West Point just to go see a football game visit, way back in the day when I was a cadet, the barracks were open, right? Anybody can go in and out, and But to get into West Point at the gate, you had to go through security, you had to present ID, and there was a process in place, right? You had to have a military ID to be on the installation. And as time went, they allowed those open. But when we went back, and I told my wife, I was like, hey, let's go check out the barracks. To my surprise, when I walked up to the door, there was an access card reader on the door, and it was red. And I was like, oh, I guess you can't just walk in the barracks anymore. And I watched a couple of cadets that were coming back. They had their ID card around their neck, and they presented their card, which was a proximity card, scanned the badge, and the badge let them in. And now the interesting part is the badge had to be recognized at the reader. Now, they couldn't just go in any other barracks. They could only go in the barracks that they were assigned to. So your point is that ID card right there, or that access reader, what it's actually doing is, I'm Mike Almeida. This is something I have, and it's going to check that access control list to say, hey, does this card serial ID number match what's on this list? If it does, I'm going to give you access. If it doesn't, you're not getting in. So in the same way, that's a physical security perimeter. What you're describing is what we would call an electronic security perimeter. Basically, in order to get access to that level or open access to the assets that are inside that virtual perimeter, for lack of better terminology, you've got to be able to identify yourself and validate you are who you say you are.
Right. Yeah. Think about the old "who goes there," right? At the end of the day, somebody's just looking for them to answer with an identity. When they come up to the gate, that's when they're going to say, "Let me make sure you are who you say you are." And we've talked before about there's basically three types of authentication, right? Something you know, something you have, or something you are. And the example that you gave for the barracks, it's something you have, right? They have an ID card that they're scanning, and for some places it's a little code pin, right? You punch in a pin that you know, and that authenticates that you are someone who should have access to this particular space and or resource. And the thing that often gets overlooked when you start talking about putting in identity and access management is inventories. What's in your business? What matters in terms of, I think of this in concentric circles, right? The most broad circle is going to be the distinction between you and the public. And when I say you, I mean your company and the people that are internal. And in some cases, you're still going to make stuff accessible to the public, regardless of who they are. They're still going to be able to, think about your website or blogs or content information you're putting out there. But there's going to be other things that you want to be just you and your team that can see that. But then there are going to be other parts of your data that are just going to be about you, or maybe a smaller part of your team. So it's elevating levels of restriction. And once you've inventoried that, everybody within your organization should understand what's sensitive and what's not. And once you start, ascribing levels of sensitivity, you've got to make sure the protections scale up with that level of sensitivity. So, you might have a resource that requires only a single form of authentication, right? Which is a password or, some push or whatnot. But as soon as it becomes a more sensitive set of data, now it requires two forms of authentication.
So, Mark, you mean to tell me that we're making all these decisions based on risk? Sorry, I had to throw that in there because that's exactly what it comes down to, right? At every point in your business, that four-letter R word is always going to show its face, and rightfully so. I'll tell you, I used to be a physical security auditor after my time in the military, and there are layers of security based on the criticality of the assets you're protecting, right? They have this in the NERC methodology, which is run by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, these requirements, they identify assets as low impact, medium impact, and high impact. And those assets that are classified as high impact have more stringent requirements. So to go to a medium impact site, you have to protect it with a physical security perimeter, 96 square inches, floor to ceiling. You can't have you have to have a 6-wall perimeter. You can't have any opening greater than 96 square inches. But when it comes to high impact assets, not only do you have to have that same control, but at your access control points into that facility, you have to present something you have as well as something you know. So they require to swipe a badge at a proximity card reader and also enter a PIN that you know in order to gain access. So again, that extra layer of validation is because the risk that that asset going down poses to the bulk power system as a whole. So again, to your point, even as a small business, if there are assets to your business that are extremely critical, perhaps you should consider what type of security methodologies from an identity and access management perspective that you want to have. Maybe it's two-factor authentication. Who knows? But that should be absolutely be a consideration as you're determining how to protect those assets, right?
Absolutely. And to your point about it being risk, right? When you categorize high impact, low impact, medium impact, there's two parts to that. One is what's the value to the business, and then two is what's the impact of the business if it were compromised.
Mm-hmm.
Compromised meaning it was shared with somebody or it's just failed, right? I mean, as we saw with the airline outages over the last 6 weeks or so, systems aren't always that somebody has taken the information. Sometimes it just stopped working.
Yeah.
Right. But that is a level of risk based on what function or value it provides to the business. And so that's why you want to make sure that those things go, together in terms of how they're protected and also identifying what the risks are, right? It's two very different risks to say, hey, this is threatened by an outside person to be stolen. This is threatened just by inherent factors of, age or workload or failures, but you still got to be able to plan for both of those.